Our first speaker is Professor Gary Libecap, who will give a presentation on the allocation of fishing permits on permits and quotas, allocation of permits and quotas, and comparing allocating by the rule of grandfathering such rights and auctioning them. Professor Gary Libecap is a professor of economics at the University of California in Santa Barbara. He is internationally a known expert on resource economics and has published several books and numerous papers on natural resources. So I give the floor to you, Gary. Thank you. Let's see here. Slide.
Okay, I think we're there. All right. Well, it's wonderful to be here. When Ragnar mentioned this possibility, I went home and I told my wife, and she said yes. That was before I even told her what it was about, because we're both very fond of Iceland, and we have many friends here. Today I'm going to talk about the allocation of fishing permits, and I'm going to do it from a property rights point of view, because these issues are not solely focused worldwide on fisheries, but in fact they occur across a range of natural resources. And to understand the economics involved and why it matters how you allocate, it's worthwhile looking in taking this broad perspective. It's also important to take this broad perspective because we just don't have that much statistical evidence across different fisheries in terms of the allocation rule. The allocation is almost always grandfathered, and there's a reason for that in terms of efficiency, not only in the generation of wealth and revenues, but also in the protection of the stock. Now, I want to tell you right off the bat, I don't own any fishing quota. I'm not a fisherman, so I don't have a stake in this game in that regard. It's based on sort of the academic research I'm aware of and that I've taken part in terms of looking at the property rights regime. As I mentioned, worldwide there is a debate about natural resources. Who should own them and who should make the primary decisions about their use? And natural resources are particularly vulnerable for this sort of thing because in some ways, they are naturally provided, and so for many people, it seems that it's only right or fair that it should be managed in the public's interest by politicians and the bureaucracy. If that didn't matter for efficiency, then this would be more or less a debate among academics, but it actually does matter for efficiency in the way in which how the resource generates wealth and how the resource is protected. The alternative is to provide a way whereby the individuals who actually are engaged in the industry make the decisions about resource use and investment and allocation and so forth. In the first case that I mentioned, the individuals themselves are really irrelevant. Okay? The primary decision makers will be politicians or agency officials guided by scientists, and the individual users themselves are just responding to the information or the dictates that come from the state. But in fact, they do respond, and they do respond differently depending upon the property rights regime. And this can have important implications for long-run wealth and also for the long-run condition of the stock. And so that's what I really want to emphasize. And in many cases, as I say here, the stock and the value of production are actually importantly influenced by the property rights regime or the allocation mechanism. And so I'll make two fundamental points today, is that long-term economic returns to individuals as well as long-term government revenues are dependent upon the allocation regime, the property rights regime. They're not independent of it, okay? And in general, grandfathering is superior to auction allocation or reallocation. I'm not against auction. In fact, Professor Charlie Plott here is world famous in the design of auctions. But he knows better than anybody how complicated these auctions are. But that's not really my point today in the cost of setting up important auctions or an auction. What I want to do is to discuss how auctions relative to grandfathering change the nature of the property right and the incentives for actual users. And so I'll look at a variety of resources and then come back to fisheries and then proceed. The overview then is I'm going to talk first about this debate, this broad debate about the ownership and management of natural resources. And because, as I mentioned, we don't have much data in fisheries, I'm going to turn to where we have a lot of data. In minerals, oil and gas, two areas that I've worked, as well as farmland, okay? So these are natural resources, but they're almost always grandfathered where production occurs in efficient ways. And in the case of farmland, as I'll point out to you, but you all know, we just don't turn these things over and auction them in short-term auctions repeatedly. It just doesn't happen. In fact, we rarely see a reallocation of farmland. Why? Because productivity collapses. And farms produce protein in the same way that, and other foodstuffs in the same way that fisheries do. So I'm going to then discuss briefly this move in fisheries to a rights-based system. And we do have evidence on that, on the beneficial effects of that. And then to ground this, I'm going to return to property rights theory. For some of you, this will be old hat. For others, maybe less so. But I want to point out the importance of property rights in terms of generating value and creating long-term incentives for investment and for trade. I'm going to point out that grandfathering falls into a category called first possession, which covers, it's the most common way of allocating property rights of any type. For example, if you award a patent in intellectual property or in pharmaceuticals or virtually anything, it's a discovery and you get a property right. That is a first possession right. And first possession rights are designed to encourage investment, encourage exploration, encourage discovery. And that's the same kind of thing that we want to encourage in fisheries. And so what I want to do then is to look briefly at the economics of first possession, so you get a sense of that literature. And then I'll turn to see how this debate over whether or not you grandfather fishing rights, which is the dominant way that you do this, or whether you would auction them. And I'm mostly concerned about auctioning existing fishing rights or among where you have incumbent fishers. You might make an argument in a new fishery that where there are no incumbents that you might auction it in that setting. But then the question is, how do you discover that fishery in the first place? And so you might want to, we'll still come back to that. So I'll compare auctions and grandfathering in fishing and then return to a conclusion. So as I mentioned, there is this notion that natural resources, among many, are essentially public resources. They should be publicly managed. In the US, we have a vast amount of land that we call public lands. Okay? And the idea is that politicians and various government agencies should decide who uses those resources and under what circumstances and so forth. In some cases, if we view these natural resources in that way, so that the state decides how a resource will be used and when it will be used and so forth, any private returns will be taxed and then distributed by the state to meet various constituent demands, okay? And in that case, the revenue objective is what dominates, because that's really what ultimately what politicians and to some degree bureaucratic officials are interested in. The management of the resource itself, especially among politicians who have shorter time horizons, becomes less relevant. And just to sort of illustrate this, in California, where Charlie Platt and I are from, the state auctions off a portion of its air emission permits. And the various branches of the state government in Sacramento have just really gotten very excited about these auction revenues that would be generated. Unfortunately, the revenues haven't come about in the same way they anticipated. They had all these planning schemes. And so now they want the state to cut back on the number of permits being allocated in order to ratchet up the price so they could earn more revenue. All right? Now, I'm not questioning any of that. What I'm pointing out is it's the revenue imperative that dominates, not the resource that becomes important. In the case of air emissions, that may be less relevant, but in fisheries it's absolutely critical because you want to find ways to protect the stock. So in the case of having a public resource, then not only would the returns be taxed, but the access might be periodically reallocated to different constituencies based on different political demands. And so distribution becomes an important goal, all right? The key assumption in all of these discussions about why a resource should be public and managed publicly is that the resource stock itself and the economic returns from it will not be affected, okay? But we just have, as I'll point out, a tremendous amount of empirical evidence that shows that's just not the case. And so I'll come back to that. The other view is the one that I'm emphasizing here, is that in fact, if these resources are privately held and decision makers are private decision makers primarily determine how the resource is used and investment and so forth, then there are spin-off benefits to others, okay? Those who supply the decision makers, those who work with the decision makers, if the access rights or ownership are sold to others and so forth. The whole economy grows, and as a consequence, there are many multiplier effects from that sort of thing. And in this case, we have, in the cleanest case, when we have private property rights, they will maximize the long-term returns, not only to individual decision makers, but to the state in terms of tax revenue. In this setting, though, entry and use are restricted to owners. If that isn't the case, then ownership doesn't have any meaning. Okay? So owners decide who has access and how the resource will be used, and the time frame defined in the property right. If it's a long-term one, then they'll think in the long term. If it's a short-term, uncertain property right, then they'll act in that way, and that might not be consistent with protecting the stock. The economic decisions made by private individuals will be molded by the market. Okay, so market signals that are generated about new demand, changes in product quality and so forth, or the nature of the product, all will be determined and responded to by owners because they're the residual claimants. They're the ones who it's in their interest to be responsive. The size of the units will be determined by the market. So if the production size is too small, then you acquire more. If it's too large, then you sell off. The point is that politicians just don't have that same incentive, okay? Because they're not residual claimants. They're not owners, all right? So they're unlikely to be responding in the same way to shifts in market information and market signals. So economic decisions are molded by market conditions. And the key assumption is that these private rights depend on security and that they be long-term. Okay. So how does grandfathering, the allocation mechanism, compare with auctioning in this particular case? All right, So in grandfathering, we assign the use right to the resource, or in the case if we're assigning the actual ownership right, we're assigning based on past use. Okay? And I'm going to come back to why that is important. Auctions, where we have repeated reallocation, if we have repeated auctions, so we auction off the rights for 5 years or 3 years or whatever, then it's the state that has the primary responsibility. So you can see the important difference between grandfathering and auctions. And the prediction here is that repeated auctions would reduce long-term fishing revenues because it would shorten and add uncertainty to any kind of property right or use right that fishers might have. Unfortunately, as I said, we just have no empirical tests about how auctions and grandfathering stack up in fisheries, because there are just very few cases where we have had auctions of auction allocation in fisheries. So let me turn to some other resources where we have a lot of evidence, and that can inform our thinking about fisheries. It's important in the case of oil and gas and minerals to keep a couple of background factors in mind. First off, that there's international competition. So many countries have oil deposits and natural gas deposits, and many countries have copper and other minerals. And so they're in competition with one another, and both labor and capital are quite mobile. Okay? So, and the scale of production is quite large. And so countries and political jurisdictions have to be quite careful in the way in which they allocate access and the type of taxing regime that they impose. Because when firms are granted sort of long-term secure production rights or use rights, then the industry flourishes. You have long-term production, employment, support to the mining or oil and gas industry, and depending on the nature of the tax regime, there's a lot of variation there. It generates long-term revenue. And two examples of quite successful countries in this regard, of course, are Chile and Australia. The tax system will be important. There are a whole host of different tax regimes to raise revenue. And there's a very large literature that you can learn from in terms of thinking about fisheries. You have royalties that are percent of production or gross returns or net returns. And those assign different levels of risk to the actual decision maker. And so in this case, most of the risk is assigned to decision makers, whereas here it's shared between the state and the individuals. There is also a lot of empirical evidence that firms shift away from high-taxed and highly regulated sectors. Okay? So if you tax a sector, a section of production, and you highly regulate it, then firms automatically shift to less regulated, less taxed areas. And in the case of oil and gas, Jim Smith has examined, so in the case of oil and gas, which is quite similar to fisheries in many ways, you want exploration companies to go out and look for this stuff, okay? And then once they find it, you want them to invest in production. And then you want them to produce in a way that you can produce over time, because if you produce too quickly, you dissipate the underground pressures that drive oil or natural gas to the surface. So the way in which you produce affects, in effect, the stock, all right? And what this research shows that depending on the royalty or tax regime, you can influence whether firms explore, how they produce, and whether their production is long-term and whether it damages the stock. So we have a lot of evidence in oil and gas that tells you about the property rights and taxing regime and its implications for production. Nevertheless, there can be a lot of pressure on governments to raise revenue, and politicians are quite responsive to these pressures. And the problem is, of course, they can raise short-term revenues but damage the stock or change incentives such that long-term revenues are reduced. And I just make some references here to, again, a very large literature on this. And just as kind of a parting case on this, if you needed any other evidence, just think about Venezuela. By some measures, has the world's largest deposits of oil, and is a country miserably poor, despite this huge resource stock from total mismanagement, primarily because the industry has been nationalized and all decisions about production and investment use are political ones, not economic ones. And so as a consequence, you get a lot of waste and a lot of mismanagement. And there are many other examples that are less extreme, but I think they're important to think about when you're thinking about fishing, because we have this evidence in other industries. I want to just briefly mention, as I said before, in agriculture, it's closer really to fishing than other kinds of manufacturing, because it's smaller scale, more individual, specific, location-specific information and so forth. So you tend to have smaller units and so forth. Nevertheless, as I mentioned before, we just do not have repeated auctions on agricultural land. Okay? And wherever, in fact, we do have redistribution, production is always forced redistribution. Production is plummeted, and so this has taken place in Brazil historically, in Mexico historically, currently in parts of Brazil, and of course in Zimbabwe, which once was the leading agriculture producer in agriculture in Africa. So these other evidence from these other resources, I think, is important to draw upon in understanding how to proceed with fisheries. If we turn more to fisheries, to put this into context, we have to recall that fisheries were the iconic open access resources. So they were the ones where there, in the worst possible case, where there were no controls on entry and no property rights of any type. Okay? And so, it's the classic race to catch fish, overcapitalization, and depletion of the stock. And the initial response to that worldwide for wild ocean fisheries has been imposition of effort controls, or in some cases also output controls. Neither of these have been particularly successful, and so recently we've moved to rights-based management, establishment of a total annual allowable catch, and then shares within that. Okay? And those shares, where they are tradable, where they're long-term, become a type of property right. And so it ties the interests of fishers to the protection of the stock, because those shares only have value if the stock is protected and maintained. And so they can expect to share in the benefits of good management, and where these things are eminently tradable, you can have consolidation and so forth. And so as a consequence, what has happened in our response to the tragedy of the commons and fisheries has really been a movement away from reliance on the state and government decision-making, and more on private individuals. And we get, again, there's a lot of evidence here in terms of the improvements of a share system. My colleagues at UC Santa Barbara have an article in Science magazine showing where shares have been implemented across 11,000 fisheries, either in actual cases or simulated cases, that the stock is rebounded and been protected. Nevertheless, because it assigns a property right, has distributional effects, and takes decision-making out of the hands of the bureaucracy and politicians, these rights-based systems remain very contentious. And other colleagues of mine have looked at the nature of the property right, and where these are weaker, less tradable, shorter term, less secure, they're just less valuable. They also serve, in many cases, likely to provide less protection to the stock. So let me just turn briefly then to a little more about what I mean when I talk about secure property rights. Well, the attributes of a property right are as follows. It assigns ownership. It decides who will make decisions and who will be the beneficiaries or bear the costs of those decisions. All right? So if I make a decision about something and you bear the costs, well, then I'll overdo it. All right? On the other hand, if I bear all the costs and you get all the benefits, I'm not going to do much of anything. All right? Whereas a clear property right that assigns those proportionately then we tend to get more efficient decisions. It also defines the time period. The longer the property right, the longer the time period that the individual will take in the decision making. It defines security, all right? So if I make a decision about a future investment, I can be quite confident that that will be carried out if the right is secure. It facilitates trade. Without a property right, you can't trade, okay? Who would you buy from? Who would you sell to? And why would anybody believe that that kind of transaction would hold up? It facilitates cooperation among owners, okay? Because all owners have an incentive that are linked to the resource, then they have incentives to maximize jointly where joint decision making can actually improve overall value. So, in net, property rights promote investment, innovation, and search, okay? Because they provide security and long-term expectations for capturing the benefits of those actions. As I mentioned to you, that there is a lot of evidence on this across resources in fisheries. There's a nice paper looking at the Pacific Northwest halibut fishery, where effort controls through seasons before the adoption of rights-based systems led to the gradual shrinking of the season to less than 6 days in the 1990s, and all the product, the halibut, had to be frozen at low value. Once you had a rights-based system, then you didn't have to fish during that system, but you could fish over a much longer period of the year. You could provide fresh product when the market wanted it and the value of the product went up. In another paper that Terry Anderson and I looked at, we looked at innovation in fisheries and the expansion into new product areas. And so, in general, the evidence that we have on rights-based systems is that they are good for the economy, they're good for fishers, and they've been good for the stock. So what can weaken a property right? What can make a property right less responsive? And when I'm talking about property rights in fisheries, I'm not talking so much about like a title to a house or something, but it's the ownership of the right to fish, okay? So it is a property right and the right to fish, because the costs of defining ownership to an entire fishery are way too large. So here are the threats, as I mentioned: short time horizons, so you get less long-term investment; uncertainty of ownership, so we have less security that decision-making that you make will actually be implemented; greater taxation of returns, of course, reduces expected benefits; and greater regulation of ownership narrows the range of decision-making. I'm not saying that there won't be cases where regulation won't be warranted, especially where there are important externalities. But in most cases, if there is excessive regulation, as I showed before with oil and gas, firms shift away from that activity, and it might be an activity you really want to engage in. So long-term secure private property rights with limited taxation and regulation are ones that typically maximize the economic value of the resource. So the question then, if rights-based management with these kind of secure property rights is so beneficial, how should we allocate them? And the answer to this, of course, I want to point out once again that there is international competition. So mostly across countries, fishing firms are going to be competing either on cost or quality. Okay? In either case, it takes investment. In having a low-cost method of fishing, or in the low-cost way of providing high-quality product. In many cases, there's relatively low profitability, and there is always high levels of uncertainty. Uncertainty as to how the stock is going to respond, uncertainty as to other environmental conditions, and uncertainty in the market. Now, market prices are likely to vary. And an important attribute that you all are aware of also is that the fishery is very heterogeneous. So that some fishers are quite more skilled in responding to and understanding how to manage and fish than are others, and so you get this hierarchy within every fishing community of the highliners are the best fishermen relative to others. So, when would we use auctions? Okay. Well, in general, in order to have any kind of auction, there has to be a well-defined owner. I don't mean the person that you're going to be auctioning to, but it's the auctioneer. In most cases, this is the state. Right? And so in the U.S., for example, the U.S. auctions off oil and gas leases in the federal government's oil and gas lands offshore. Okay? Closer to shore, they're owned by the states. Okay? But in both cases, the governmental unit auctions those off because that unit actually owns them and has the ability to keep out those that bid or that don't win the bid from actually occupying. You can sell the asset or production rights when you have this. You can maximize the number of buyers and bidders by advertising an auction, so you get more information from an auction. And you potentially could maximize sales revenue. And you can open it up to a large number of individuals who might not otherwise know about the fact that you want to auction this asset off. So there are plenty of reasons under certain circumstances to auction. But as Professor Platt has shown and others, these auctions are very tricky to design and they're complicated. So they're not free. Okay? And in general, compared to grandfathering, they're much more costly to implement. Okay? But as I mentioned, we auction off rights for oil and gas in the U.S. on federal lands, the electronic spectrum that Professor Platt has helped to describe, air emission permits, and so forth. In most of these cases, there were not incumbent owners or incumbent users. And so an auction might make sense in those circumstances. In fisheries, it raises a lot of questions about who would participate, how competitive it might be, the size of the allotment. All these have to be decided by politicians or the bureaucracy. How long will these be? Will it be a one-time auction, or will it be repeated? So it'll be for 5 years and then you reallocate, or 10 years and you reallocate. Obviously, the longer the time period, the better in terms of the property right. But all of these, and how much you'll trade them, and so forth, all of these have to be decided not so much by the industry, but by agency officials or politicians. The problem is, as I said, we have almost no empirical examples of auctions being used. Single auctions could allocate production rights, and if it's a one-time auction in a new fishery, then the efficiency effects are probably going to be quite small, because then they could be traded and so forth if the transaction costs are relatively low. The auction, nevertheless, is a tax, because you have to pay for the production, the right to produce. All right. On the other hand, if we have repeated auctions, then it becomes much more concern. It's a tax, because periodically you'll have to bid to see if you can keep or gain access, and it will shorten use right and change incentives with regards to the fishery. It will change property rights. As I said, in some cases where we have a new fishery, we might use auctions, but the question is, how did you find out about that fishery in the first place? And would you, if this became the rule, that every time you discovered a new fishery, you as the discoverer would not be the one to have the production right, but in fact it would be auctioned off, you can imagine that definitely would change incentives to engage in discovery and search. There have been a number of studies of the relatively few auctions that have occurred in Russia, Estonia, and New Zealand. They have, in every case I'm familiar with, unless it's a brand new fishery, been abandoned for a variety of reasons. Okay? And John Lanham has a nice survey piece about allocation techniques in fisheries, and it is just overwhelmingly grandfathered. Okay? And what I'm arguing here is there are efficiency reasons why that is the case. So what does grandfathering do? Well, it assigns the right to produce based on past production. So it provides commitment to existing fishers who have success in the fishery, because these are the people then that will have a record of historical catch. Because it provides that commitment, it provides more security for financing, because you have to go out and borrow for vessels and so forth. Collateral is hard to show in a situation like that, so these are most relational kinds of borrowing. It rewards the most efficient fishers with experience and time in the fishery. It rewards enterprise, okay? And it aligns incentives with stock value. Relatively less costly. You have to agree upon what the historical time period will be. And once you do that, and getting the information on historical catch. But beyond that, and I'm not trivializing that, but nevertheless is relatively less costly than designing an auction. Who benefits from grandfathering? Well, the industry. Who benefits from auctions? Primarily the state, for short-term revenue reasons, and for government agencies who design these auctions or implement them. The important thing to keep in mind, if you have a repeated auction, then decision-making is largely kept with politicians and with the bureaucracy. If you have grandfathering and long-term production use rights, then most of the decision-making is really delegated to the actual users. And so it reduces the discretion that politicians and regulatory agencies have over the resource. And that's one reason why they tend not to be in favor of them. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, grandfathering falls into a class of ownership called first possession. And as I also mentioned, this is everywhere, all the time, the most common way of allocating a property right. So not just in fisheries, it's in everything. You line up to go into, to see a display or an exhibit or go to a movie. That's first possession. The first person there is the first person, that's the person who gets the first right, and second person and so forth and so on. Okay? And there is a large literature. Richard Epstein's case is a particularly nice one for summarizing the advantages. But this is well built, described as part of common law countries and civil law countries. Okay? So this is part of the law, regardless of whether it's a civil or common law country. It, as I mentioned before, it recognizes existing users. If the most efficient, well, the ones that have the record of production. It rewards local information, recognizes prior use, rewards search. That's why we assign patents based on first possession. Discoverers become the owners. And moreover, the market decides the size of the allotment. Okay? So at auction design, you don't have to figure out, well, how many of these, what will the size be, and will we let them be traded, and all those kinds of things. You don't have to decide that. That'll be handled by the individuals themselves as they engage in production. So to conclude, worldwide, there is a debate over natural resources and how they'll be used. And fisheries are just part of that debate. And natural resources can be a blessing or a curse for a country. Okay? Some countries do well without many natural resources, like Japan. Other countries do horribly with a lot of natural resources, like Venezuela. So it really depends on the institutional or the property right structure as to how this will play out. This debate really centers on ownership and distribution. And that's one reason why it's so contentious. Because if you assign a property right to individuals, a property right of some type, then that's where most of the decision-making will lie. And it reduces the realm of decision-making available to politicians and agencies. How you design then this allocation mechanism will then affect the incentives. If it's very short-term and very weak, then we'll have a lot of competition and a lot of waste. And what we want is the alternative sort of long-term decision-making that maximizes the value of the resource. And so all this depends on the property rights allocation, its security, and its time period. And as I said in the very beginning, the allocation system actually matters. All right? The value of the resource and the revenues generated from it are not independent of the allocation regime. Secure property rights advance this objective of maximizing the value of the resource, and grandfathering is consistent with the secure property rights regime. Okay, thank you.